I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you all so very much for joining us and for your ongoing support. We are thrilled to be kicking off our new 2020 election series, and we could not have done it without the generosity of our sponsors and our community partners. I would like to take this time to thank our 4 key sponsors for this series: Andrew Tavakoli and Dan Schnur, who are members of our board of directors, Dick Mader, an International Circle member, and Joel Mogi, a diplomat level member. Gentlemen, thank you so very much for your continued support of our organization. We hope everyone will enjoy this wonderful new series. I've noticed that a lot of our viewers today are new to the Council Town Hall. We are a nonprofit 501c3 with the mission of informing our members and our audiences about the most compelling international, national, and regional issues. We are a nonpartisan organization, and an important part of our programs are that we enable our audiences to ask questions of the speakers to foster a more engaged discussion. When the COVID hit us all in early March, we too pivoted from our usual in-person programs to these live streams, which we are providing for free as a public service, which is why we can't do this without your ongoing support. So please just take a minute at the end of this program and let us give you information on how you can make contributions and make a difference and keep us going. It is now my great pleasure to introduce today's program, American Leadership in the 21st Century, with General John R. Allen, President of the Brookings Institution. Today's program will be moderated by Robert Abernethy, who is Chairman of the American Standard Development Company. He's also a member of our board of directors. If you would like to submit a question today, we'll be taking questions in about 20 minutes. There's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program. And as always, Jessica will try to get to as many of your questions as possible. So Bob and General Allen, it's time for me to turn this program over to you. We are so thrilled to have you both with us today. Bob, we look forward to a very, very engaging discussion. So let me turn that over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kim. We appreciate your leadership that you've given the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I am a proud, more than 50-year member of both the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall, and I would like to second your remarks, urging those who are listening in to become more involved in the activities of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council Town Hall in the future. There are a robust set of programs and a robust set of ways to participate in that. Today we have a program talking about American leadership. I know Harry Truman once said that all leaders are readers, but not all readers are leaders. I'm sure that he hasn't met some of our current leadership. One of the ways to think about leadership is to look at the work that David Rubenstein has done, who is a leader himself, but he has studied leadership and, as a matter of fact, interviewed many top U.S. leaders. He thinks, and I agree with him, that there are a set of characteristics that most leaders draw from, not having all those characteristics, but at least several of them. He talks about luck, the desire to succeed, the pursuit of something new and unique, hard work, focus, persistence, persuasiveness, humble demeanor, credit sharing, ability to keep learning, integrity, and response to a crisis. Today, we are delighted to have with us one of our foremost U.S. leaders of the last number of decades, General John Allen. He has spent 42 years in the service of this country in military uniform, the first 4 years in the U.S. Navy, and the last 38 years in the Marine Corps. General, I would like to have you go back to the period of time when you were 16 years old and you were thinking about where you wanted to go to college, and tell us about what influenced you then to choose, make the choices you made, and what role your dad played in mentoring you in those choices.
Bob, thanks. It's wonderful to be with you today. Kim, thank you for your remarks. And let me just second something that Bob and Kim talked about. That's the World Affairs Council. This is a wonderful platform, the World Affairs Council, and it gets at many of the greatest challenges that we face on a moment-to-moment basis, both as a country, but also in the context of us being a part of the community of nations. So we at Brookings are very pleased to frequently partner with the World Affairs Councils, and the LA World Affairs Council and Town Hall is a really important platform. And I'm honored, so honored today to be with you on this. Let me also say that we on the East Coast are thinking about all of you on the West Coast constantly, and the awful climate conditions and the awful fires that are going on from Washington through California. You're in our thoughts and our prayers all the time. We know how difficult a moment this is for you. The losses have been enormous, and we are with you in this moment of crisis. And just to show how big this is, yesterday, our meteorologists in the news pointed out that the haze over the sun on the East Coast as we were watching sunset was a result of the fires from the West Coast. So we are with you in this moment, and we're very, very sorry for what you're having to go through right now. Bob, my father was enormously influential in my decision ultimately to go to Annapolis. He had served in World War II and the Korean War in the Navy. I was born into a Navy family, grew up in the Naval Service, spent my entire life to the point where I retired as a 4-star general in the Naval Service, the Marine Corps, of course, being part of the Naval Service. But my father had been on a destroyer in 1941 that was torpedoed by a German U-boat. It was torpedoed even before World War II started. It was in October. And he told me as a young child, he remembered in that moment of crisis when it was very likely they were convoying a British convoy out of Canada, that we were going to lose this destroyer in the waters of the North Atlantic during a critical moment. And he remembered how the officers of the wardroom of that destroyer, the USS Kearney, had come together to save the ship, to lead the sailors through that crisis and save the ship. All of them were Naval Academy graduates. And from that moment until the time I entered the academy myself, my father extolled the virtues of the academy and the academy education. And it was a great honor for me ultimately to fulfill both my own desire to be an officer of the Naval Service, but to fulfill my great desire that I would associate myself with the military in the Naval Service by going to the Naval Academy. And it was a great opportunity. And he truly had a major formative effect in my life in extolling those great virtues of leadership that he learned throughout 34 years in the Naval Service, but also ultimately he was able to pass along to me to set the conditions for my own leadership education, which went on for, as you say, 42 years. I never completed my education in leadership. It just started the day I entered the Naval Academy.
Talk a little bit about when you started looking around first at the Naval Academy, that you felt a little bit ill-prepared to compete to enter that class, and you did something special for a year?
Sure. Well, the Naval Academy is an engineering institution, and it doesn't make any difference what your major is when you go to Annapolis. I would eventually end up as the commandant there, so I had the chance to personally influence ultimately the curriculum. And the curriculum is intended to be highly technical. It's an engineering curriculum with heavy doses of mathematics and science, as you might imagine. And I had gone to a small school in Virginia that, I don't know if this term actually applies, was a liberal arts school. Very, very strong in English literature and English and history, civics, which we don't teach much these days, and history. And to some extent science, and to some extent math. And while I had done very well in school, it looked like that the Naval Academy technical curriculum was going to be pretty challenging. So I did something that is still available today, and I think it's an enormously valuable program. It's called the Naval Academy Prep School, and West Point has one, the Air Force Academy has one, where I enlisted in the Navy, and my classmates in high school thought I was out of my mind. This was 1971. I was barely 17 years old, and you'll recall in those days, it was a pretty tough moment to be in the service. And did a year at the Naval Academy Prep School, which was very heavy in science and math, and it prepared me very well. And I would eventually go into the Naval Academy, and my major for 4 years was operations analysis, which is for all intents and purposes applied math, and it prepared me very well for that.
How did you make the decision coming out of the Naval Academy to enter the Marine Corps as opposed to the regular Navy fleet?
Well, my desire had always really been to be a Marine. It was my father was not at all happy about that, having been in the Navy himself. And from my perspective, he had raised me in many ways to want to be deeply involved in the defense of our nation. And he had ultimately had responsibility for imbuing in me the desire to be part of a service where, if our country called, that service was likely to be the first force committed into the defense of our nation. And I wanted to be part of that. And that was and remains the United States Marine Corps. So at the Naval Academy, the curriculum there was taught by some civilians, but many Navy and Marine officers. And again, this was I entered in 1972. The Marine officers there were hand-selected and were just magnificent. And they just reinforced my desire to be a Marine. And I made the decision in my senior year, my first class year, and never looked back.
Your wife's family also had a connection, didn't they, with the Marine Corps?
Sure. She's, as we say, a third-generation Marine wife. Her mother was an Army nurse on the Western Front in an Army field hospital who met her grandfather, who was a Marine second lieutenant on the Western Front in World War I. By the way, Kathy's grandmother, the nurse, had deployed to France from having been in the Army expedition that chased to Pancho Villa. In the southern part of the United States. So she went straight from a field duty, straight to the Western Front. They met and married. He would go on to be a brigadier, having commanded a Marine regiment in World War II at the battles of Kwajalein, Saipan, and Tinian, and eventually in the Battle of Iwo Jima. And Kathy's mother was a child born to that marriage, and she would marry a young Marine captain who sadly, very tragically, was killed in action fighting on Okinawa in the closing weeks of the war. But in her second marriage, Kathy's dad, she would marry a Marine who had been disabled in the Battle of Guadalcanal in World War II. And then Kathy, of course, was a child of that marriage, the second marriage, and she and I would marry. And of course, I'd spend my entire career. So she actually has far greener blood probably than I do. And my daughters once said to my wife, do we have to marry Marines? And my wife said that chances are that you don't have to, but the chances are you're gonna, and neither did, and I think they're both happier for it. So
that's great. Talk a little bit about the concept of service and what it means to serve one's country through military service, and what it means to risk one's life on the battlefield, and sometimes to give one's life on the battlefield.
Let's talk a little bit about leadership too, because leadership is the essential component of service in my mind. And from my perspective, I was an infantry officer, so I spent a lot of time in units that were not technology heavy, they were not equipment heavy, we were grunts. And leadership was at a premium there. and the battle color regiment, the battle color of my battalion, was always really the centerpiece of who we identified as Marines. And I always felt that as I looked at the leaders that were those who I'd either like to be or I'd like to lead, they had several characteristics with them. First, they came from a position of humility. They were humble. They weren't arrogant. They were humble. They recognized their limitations. They recognized their strengths, but they were humble leaders. But they were also servants. They recognized that they had to serve those that they led, but they also had to serve their mission. And the old saying is, people first, mission always. That is probably at the heart of the servant leader. So for me, a humble servant leader was essential for success in the military. And then there were other factors as well. You know, life in the world that I lived in, as in the Corps, which included tours in Bosnia and tours in Iraq and in Afghanistan, it required selflessness. And I don't attempt to purport, Bob, and for the audience, that we in the military have a corner on leadership. No, leadership, of course, occurs in every sector of our world and our society in the human experiment. But for me, in the world that I lived in, the humble servant who was utterly selfless, willing to sacrifice, willing, in fact, for self-sacrifice to give the last full measure to their country. That was the world that I lived in. And we swore an oath to the Constitution of the United States of America. We didn't swear an oath to a person or to a piece of fabric or to a symbol. We swore an oath to the Constitution, which is a set of principles that undergirds America. And America really is an idea. And the Constitution, in fact, is what brings and operationalizes that idea into existence. And the role that we played as the military was to be prepared to give our very lives to preserve the principles of the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And I just drew that from my oath of office. And so the humble servant who is utterly selfless, willing to sacrifice herself or himself at a moment's notice, at the drop of a hat if necessary, either themselves or to lead their units into the fire of combat, but in the service of the Constitution. That's who we are as a military. And that makes us unique on the planet, actually, and why we are actually so good at what we do.
Talk a little bit about what the phrase "no soldier or no Marine left behind" means and what's involved there.
Sure, it means a lot. First, I'll just say in Afghanistan, but in Iraq as well, and in other places, there is a moment when you have what we call the fallen angel, a Marine or a soldier or a sailor or an airman who was killed in action. And we went through a solemn ceremony to carry the remains of that individual up the back ramp of an aircraft to transport home. And the enormity, the reality of that utter sacrifice, that selfless sacrifice, comes home very clearly and very completely when you are standing on the back ramp of that aircraft, placing the coffin, flag draped, on the floor of that aircraft. And when that ramp goes up, you know that sacrifice will next be visited upon that precious family back in the United States. We're never going to leave our dead behind. If there are those of us alive to recover that sailor or that Marine or that soldier or that airman, we'll pay a great price to get those remains back. Of course, our history is replete with occasions where our young troops gave so much from themselves to recover our wounded. And one of the experiences that I had in a place called Fallujah, in Iraq a few years ago was to be with one of my, it had been one of my midshipmen at the Naval Academy when I was commandant, who passed away when I was with him. He'd been caught in an ambush in Fallujah. He was actually in a safe firing position, was covering the other members of the patrol with fire. But when one of the members of the patrol was hit and knocked down in the open, without even thinking about it, this young Marine got up and moved out into the ambush site to try to recover this fallen Marine and paid the last full measure for his dedication. He was not going to leave that wounded Marine behind in the kill zone. This is very real to us. We will never leave our dead or our wounded behind. And our history has story after story, chapter after chapter, where even under the most adverse circumstances, and again, I'm a Marine, so one of the worst was our withdrawal from the Chosin Reservoir in 1950 when we were surrounded by the Chinese during the Korean War. And we carried for miles through the mountains of Korea, attacked on all sides all day long. That 1st Marine Division fought its way to the coast and carried with it all of its wounded and all of its dead. We left no one behind, Bob.
That's very moving. I'd like to come back a little bit later to your time at the Naval War College and your 3 master's degree programs you went through and your command of the European Command and ISAF and the U.S. Forces Afghanistan, and move just for a few minutes to your current leadership role heading Brookings. What is Brookings? What does it do? What does it try to accomplish?
Well, the technical term that you'll hear applied to that kind of an organization is a public policy research institution. And we do research on public policy. You also hear the term think tank. And so I'll just use that euphemism. Policy that emanates from decisions in government either can emerge from public policy research. In other words, we give somebody a good idea, or policy exists and we do research on that policy with the idea of helping decision makers improve that policy or make it better or make it more applicable to the society within which it must exist. And then periodically, and sadly of late, we've seen a lot of bad policy that has emerged. And we'll provide what we think is not just a critique, because anybody can throw stones, but we'll provide what we believe are logical, nonpartisan, evidence-based, data-driven solutions to the policy dilemmas that we face today. And so for us, several things are important. A, we think we do the public good, and we're based on an absolute commitment to human rights, gender equality, equality across the board, social justice, racial justice and equality. We believe that with every fiber of our being. But we also believe that we have to do our work in a nonpartisan way, not bipartisan, but a nonpartisan way. And often we seek the voices of both parties to both help us or endorse the work we're doing so that it can be acceptable to the broad general public. But very importantly as well, this is essential for the credibility of the institution. Our work has to be done. It has to be evidence-based. It has to be big data driven as best we can, given the availability of big data. And it ultimately has to pass the muster that we place in the institution on the very highest standards of our published work. And so what we like to think is that Brookings is doing the public good. It is oriented on improving and addressing issues associated with equality and social justice. In particular, is sort of a unique think tank because we have, and I'll very quickly go through this, we have 5 major sectors. One on economic studies, which, as you might imagine, given the nature of COVID right now and the economic downturn, is just churning out work constantly. And in economic studies are a couple people, some of the some of our audience may have heard of, Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen. We're very proud to have them with us. And in governance studies, and governance studies is also churning out work 24 hours a day, because it is in governance studies that we're doing analysis on the state of American education, which has taken a huge blow in the nature of COVID, as well as Center for Technology Innovation, where we're talking a lot about the future of technology. But very importantly, the preponderance of governance studies is now studying the nature of the presidential campaign. Third area is metropolitan policy studies, and we have had strong relationships out of that area with places like Los Angeles and with San Diego, other cities on the East Coast or West Coast and in the central part of the country as well. And we go there to provide policy recommendations to state and local and municipal governments, bringing in the private sector, bringing in educational institutions, bringing in philanthropic organizations. Fourth area is in global economy and development. We have an obligation as a great nation and as a people to do what we can to help for the development of the rest of the world. And that's an area we spend a lot of time studying, particularly in sustainability and the sustainable development goals. And then finally, foreign policy and, in parentheses, defense. And so we're almost 500 strong, about 300 scholars specifically. And any one of those 5 programs is almost as big as many think tanks are today. So we're a big organization, and we work across sectors to try to bring together a synergy of expertise so that we can really address the critical issues we face today. And we evacuated our campus on the 12th of March because of COVID. We've not been back. So this is my office. You're looking at my living room. This is my office. But in that time, we have published more than 1,000 individual policy papers on COVID. COVID as it relates to our disenfranchised populations, COVID as it relates to inequality, COVID as it relates to the economy, COVID as it relates to the medical challenges associated with it, COVID as it relates to reopening our country and recovering our economy. 1,000 pieces, and that's just part of what we've done. We've been very busy.
And I might add, 100 years old and $100 million a year budget.
We are, that's right.
When you first became president and CEO of Brookings on October 4th, 2017, you took a look at the programming areas that you just set forth to us, and you concluded you'd like to nudge the work of the institution in one important direction, and you chose the American middle class as that direction. So why did you make that choice? What does the middle class matter, and who is the middle class?
Well, the middle class matters entirely to the country. In fact, the strength of America is both founded and on a day-to-day basis supported on the shoulders of the middle class. And the middle class has been in distress for years in the United States, but it has really become under duress in the last decade or so, especially with the turn down after 2008 and 9, when much of the middle class never really recovered. So for me, the challenges and the stress and the duress of the middle class had several outcomes. One is we as a nation can never really achieve that which we could as long as there was this much duress and stress within the middle class. And increasingly larger and larger segments of our population are becoming disenfranchised. We'll never have the opportunity to achieve the opportunities that their parents had. Now, at a very personal level, as a commander, watching my Marines and soldiers, other of the services in combat, where these kids were completely selfless in their willingness to give their lives for each other. And they came from every race, every faith, every corner of the country. Yet when they went home, their families' homes were being foreclosed upon. Their parents were out of work. The communities were stricken with addiction to painkillers, to fentanyl. They were really under pressure. And yet these kids were willing to give everything on the edge of American influence to keep us safe. To me, it was an absolute necessity that Brookings had to concentrate on the future of the American middle class. Now, I added several other priorities as well. We have 4 at the institution now. The second one is one you'll recognize because it's technically the subject of our meeting today, which is American middle class American leadership in the 21st century. It has many components to it, but the institution is capable of embracing American leadership in the 21st century, which is about America and China, and America and Russia, and America and India, and America and our essential relationship in the context of the transatlantic relationship with Europe. But very importantly, America and the future of democracy in the world, the community of democratic states that stand for the rule of law and human rights and a capitalist economy that is inclusive, not exclusive. And then very importantly, we talk about American leadership in not just the 21st century, but in the Middle East. Which is essential. It has been a lightning rod for American attention and resources for many years. I was personally involved in the peace talks between the Israelis and the Palestinians. I led the conversation on the security mechanisms that would have to exist for a 2-state outcome. And then finally, American leadership in climate, something that California deals with every single day. American leadership in rapid urbanization around the world and the challenges that will face. American leadership in dealing with challenges of demography, which is, of course, making it so difficult for much of the developing world to move itself out of poverty. And then, of course, American leadership in technology. And then the third of the 4 is artificial intelligence and emerging technology, because artificial intelligence is going to touch us all in the 21st century. And much of the world in which all of us on this call today will exist in is already shaped by some form or another of artificial intelligence. But as the algorithms become more sophisticated, it has the potential both to make our world far better in the context of the human experiment, in the context of health and pharmacy and transportation and education. It can make our lives much better. But we have already seen how artificial intelligence can be used for surveillance. Artificial intelligence can be used for micro-targeting of our children in the context of advertisements and revenue generation by tech companies. So it is a double-edged blade. And we're going to study artificial intelligence. We're going to study emerging technologies like biotech and others to try to help Americans and American leaders deal with policy issues. And then finally, I think very importantly, and these aren't in precedence, they are all co-equal, is the 4th presidential research priority, which is about race, social justice, and equity. Race, social justice, and equity. We think Brookings has an absolute obligation to play very heavily in that area, because the systemic racism that we've had to deal with in this country, virtually our entire history, has led us to a point now where the society is boiling over. And Brookings has embraced an absolute obligation to deal with this and to try to provide realistic and credible policy options to help us to move this needle forward on social equality that this country must have for us to go forward as a great nation.
And there's a connection, too, between artificial intelligence and your emphasis on the role of the middle class, because 2.5 million of us in America earn our living by driving vehicles. And 80 to 90% of those jobs 5 years from now are at jeopardy. So I know that fits into the study you're doing. I know also the automation of McDonald's and other fast food outlets and companies has the same potential for affecting and exacerbating the problem of the middle class and the income differential that you've so aptly demonstrated over the last 30 or 40 years in categories. I know that McDonald's had put out a study which showed that the putting in of automatic ordering, eliminating the order takers, increases the food purchased by 30%, which is a rather staggering statistic. And that tells you what company wouldn't automate like that if without having to get larger premises or more people or spend more money on other things, get a 30% boost in sales. It's very inevitable happening. I would like to switch to one question here on COVID. You talked about the hundreds, if not thousands, of papers that Brookings has produced on COVID. I'd like to ask your opinion on the difference between the United States and Taiwan and how leadership may have affected that. Taiwan has about 24 million people. To date, they've had 7 deaths from COVID and about 450 cases. If you were to extrapolate the 24 million to about the 330 million people we have here in the United States and extrapolate those deaths, the number of deaths on that kind of a outcome basis would be about 100 in comparison with what is now approaching 200,000. How do you conclude this great disparity between outcome results happened? What might leadership have to do with that result?
That's a great question, Bob. First, I know President Tsai in Taiwan, and he's an exceptional leader. In fact, if you look at East Asia in general, you'll find that many of the states in East Asia did very well, to include Vietnam, to include Taiwan, to include South Korea. We'll take China as a different issue. But first and foremost, those nations, to include many countries in Europe, those nations which did the best in dealing with COVID initially were those that recognized it for the challenge that it was, mobilized the population to meet that challenge, led at the national level with coherent national plans, both in terms of dealing with it at a social level, dealing with it at an economic, dealing with it at a medical level, and trying to mobilize the science within that society to try to deal with the infections itself. You know, today, we'll probably pass 195,000 dead in the United States. We'll probably pass 6,600,000 infected. You just did the math a moment ago, and proportionately, we are way out of whack compared to many of the other nations in the world who, A, recognized it for what it was, leveled with the people, created a national plan which had capacity to be embraced by the sub-elements, the sub-national governmental elements, whether they're provinces or municipalities or prefectures, whatever it may be. Also leverage the science. Let science drive the social interaction, which not only sought to limit the spread of the disease. You've heard the term flatten the curve. You know, we seek the R rate, the infection rate. If it's above 1, that means that the infection is spreading. If it's below 1, that means the infection is decreasing. And the R rate below 1, many of these countries were able to do that. Closing their borders, creating social distancing, those measures with certain industries that require social interaction, they took the steps necessary at a national level. And then the national government supported the subnational governments in executing, didn't undermine them the way we in the United States, where we undermined governors right and left. They had a unity of approach from the national level right down to the individual. Permitted them to flatten the curve, get the R rate below 1, emphasize that the science is the way to go about this, and then it gave those states the capacity to begin in a systematic way to think about recovery. but very importantly, reopening, because you can't recover without reopening, because the economy and the disease are inextricably linked. You cannot survive, the economy cannot survive or recover without getting the disease under control. It can be done, but the reopening process, which leads then to long-term recovery, has to account for the R rate. It has to account for the state of the science. And if your plans for reopening don't account for that, and we saw this all over the United States as opposed to Taiwan and South Korea and in Europe, although there are countries in Europe that failed to reopen properly and they're spiking again, where you saw that there was a coordinated measure between controlling the R factor and reopening, those states were able to preclude another outbreak. And we got a challenge coming, and that is we're moving into the autumn. We're moving into the season of the flu in and of itself. We're also seeing that in the global south, which has had to deal with COVID below the equator, as the temperatures cool in the north, that disease will migrate into the global north. So we're about to see an intersection between the annual flu and the migration of COVID back into the global north. And we've got to be thinking in these terms. We've got to be thinking about the R rate and how we can flatten the curve and get the infection rate below 1 so that we can then pursue rational strategies for reopening schools, reopening restaurants, reopening the hospitality industry, and doing it in a way that appreciates the realities of science, which of course is manifested in social distancing, and anticipates ultimately operating in this gray zone of the relationship of the disease to the economy until such time as a vaccine can come forward and a widely available therapeutic, and of course a testing regime. So where states were successful, they flattened the rate. They have been able to organize the medical support in a way that maximized the capacity for therapeutics, and they had a testing regime that gave instantaneous feedback within the society of where hotspots were, so they could then move to control it. So Taiwan is an example. South Korea is an example. Other countries are examples, and we should be following those examples as well.
John, I wanted to just say that I agree with absolutely everything that you just said, but I want to go on to note that regarding Taiwan, that the current vice president of Taiwan is Dr. Chen, and he served his term from 2016 through 2020 as vice president. He led the COVID drive and was the leadership for the COVID drive and much of that drive in Taiwan. He, prior to assuming the vice presidency, was the chief health and medical officer of Taiwan, and he is an epidemiologist, and he spent 7 years gaining the knowledge to be applied in Taiwan, 39 miles northeast of the US White House. With all of that knowledge that he used in Taiwan came out of Baltimore, Johns Hopkins University, the Bloomberg School of Public Health, and was all available to our leadership in Washington and was not used as you described. And we have, instead of 100 deaths, 185,000 deaths. So I think it probably is time that we need to, unfortunately, I have a lot more questions I'd like to ask, but I think it's time to turn the program back to Jessica for questions from our good participants in this conversation this morning.
Thank you
Bob,
so much.
Let me come in, Jessica, in one moment. Let me come in right behind you, Bob. Thank you for that clarification, because what you've just done in describing how Taiwan reacted and how Taiwan used the extraordinary expertise and experience of Dr. Chen, you just demonstrated how a nation that lets science drive its COVID strategy can inevitably, with leadership and science solve this matter.
Thank you so much. Yes, we have a ton of questions coming in. We'll try to get through as many as we can. General Allen, our first question. Israel, Bahrain, and the UAE have signed a peace deal this morning, brokered by Jared Kushner and President Trump. What effect will this have on other countries in the Middle East?
Well, I think it's hard to say. I worked at very hard. I've got a lot of time on the ground in the Middle East, and I know many of those leaders, the leaders in particular of all of those countries. It's a positive thing from my perspective that the UAE was willing to go unilaterally forward. It's not a border country. It's not a frontline state for Israel. So the risks itself are low, but it's an important gesture for the Mohammed bin Zayed, the Crown Prince, to move forward with that agreement. I think it's also interesting that we've now had a second state in the GCC come forward, with King Hamad being willing also to sign a peace agreement with the Israelis. On this subject, by and large, have been the Saudis, and of course, everyone in that region looks over their shoulder to see what the Saudis think before typically they'll do something. So I think it's very interesting, and in particular, given the close relationship between Bahrain and the kingdom, that Bahrain felt it was green lighted by the Saudis to go forward. I don't think we'll see the Saudis come forward for some period of time, if they come at all. But the fact that Bahrain came forward and has now recognized Israel as a state should, by 1 degree of separation, indicate that the Saudis favored it. They would never have done it without the Saudis green lighting them to do that. Bahrain is of course unique. It is a Shia majority state ruled by a royal family that is Sunni. It has been particularly susceptible to being undermined by Iranian fifth column insurgents and interference. Some of that has been a bit murky at the edges between the Sunnis and the Shias, and we've had some problems over the potential control mechanisms put at work there. But the bottom line is, this is a positive, in my mind, a positive outcome. How it leaves the Arab Peace Initiative, which, as you may know, was a stipulation of over 50 Arab states and Muslim states to immediately recognize the state of Israel when the ink dries on a two-state outcome. How that leaves the state of the Arab Peace Initiative, I think, remains to be determined. But for me, the big issue that remains to be determined, because neither Bahrain or the Emirates are frontline states, the big issue remains the Palestinian people. And I spent a lot of time in that region seeking to create the environment through our security talks, whereby the political talks could go forward between Israel and the Palestinians to solve the final status issues that could move us towards a two-state outcome. Since we don't hear much about how these two steps, big steps taken by these two Arab states in the Gulf, how these relate directly to the future of the Palestinian people and a two-state outcome and the future of a independent and sovereign and peaceful Palestine, that to me is the principal gap in the conversation. I'm happy about much of this, but I will always be focused. Beyond my commitment to the security of Israel, I'll always be focused, given my prior experience within the region, on the future of the Palestinian people and the United States' commitment to a two-state outcome.
Thank you so much. Our next question: despite struggles in places like Ukraine and Belarus, we have seen regression from democracy in places where we expected democracy to be flourishing. How do you see democracy faring in the next decades?
We have, I think, before you came along, Bob and I were watching the Cold War come to an end. a number of years ago, I think that there was a sense that we had that there was an inevitable arc of history that would deliver us into a world where democracy would prevail. The fall of the Soviet Union, the dismemberment of its empire, the broad aspirations of huge segments of the human population seeking to exist in democratic societies where human rights and economic opportunity would be afforded to everyone. We believed that we were headed in that direction. But in the last decade, and in the last several years in particular, we have seen a slippage in democracy. We've seen it in Europe. We have seen it elsewhere. My concerns are expanded, not just because we have seen the political slippage of democracy, and we have seen that strong men, and they're always strong men, and by the way, the most successful responses to COVID have come from countries that have been led by women, which I think is something we should pay very close attention to. But the issues associated with COVID has given a number of strong men opportunities to erode democratic institutions and democratic processes within their countries that they would never have had without COVID. And then finally, we have to be very attentive to the world that we face now, and we talked about artificial intelligence, the world that we face now where artificial intelligence, big data analytics, and supercomputing is having a deleterious effect on the whole on representative democracy and human rights, where it is strengthening, in fact, authoritarian states. China, for example, is the most authoritarian surveillance state on the planet. And many other states are following suit. And in development practices that China pursues in places in the world, part of the export of the Chinese relationship with those countries is an entire mentality for and equipment to support the surveillance of the populations to ensure the continuity of those elements with whom China is having contact. So we have an absolute slippage of democracy. I think in some respects, this is a result of the Great Recession and the failure of globalization and political elites to fulfill the needs of many of the segments of the population. We've seen it because of challenges coming out of the Middle East. We have seen it because of power grabs as a result of COVID. We've also seen it in some respects both accelerated and abetted by the emergence of the digital environment in which we find ourselves. And we better pay very close attention to this erosion and potentially what the United States can do to arrest this erosion and ultimately, once again, shine as the beacon of democracy. And our light ain't shining very brightly right now, frankly.
Thank you. Given the current partisanship in the US today, how is it possible to have an objective policy? Aren't values an essential component of policy decisions as well? There appears to be a divide in values related to the partisanship today more than in the past.
That's an important question, I think. I'm not sure I agree necessarily with the framing. I think values are values. And if your values are about human rights, if they're about equal rights for all, if they're about the rule of law, as espoused in many respects by our Constitution, those values are pretty important. And they're difficult to hijack if you're on the far right wing or you're in the far left wing. And so when people want to argue with me about a particular policy that we may take at Brookings, and I find that argument flies in the face of the values that we espouse at the institution, I'm very comfortable with the fact that we'll take a position on something and we won't budge off that position because we believe that our values, which inherently extol and celebrate the human nature and human rights as guaranteed under our Constitution, I'm pretty comfortable with those values. Other values that don't celebrate human rights, that aren't willing to acknowledge a free and impartial press, that aren't willing to give freedom of speech, Those are not, in my mind, values. Those are preferences. Those are bad behaviors. And I think we have to be willing to say which are values that we're willing to embrace as a people and which are just bad habits.
Thank you. This will be our final question because I know we're almost at the end of the hour. Which president or presidents in U.S. history best embody the servant leadership model you described?
Give me a second here. Folders that I didn't expect I'd have to open.
I know, going through that elementary song where we had to learn all the presidents' names.
Yeah, I didn't go to that school. I'm not hesitating because they aren't out there. I'm hesitating because I've seen those qualities in some form or another in many American presidents. I think Jimmy Carter, for example, while he took a lot of heat for the quality of his presidency, was a man of enormous moral strength and moral authority and powerful values. I got to know, and who am I to say this? I think I had a good relationship with President Obama. And I can remember the sit room on a couple of occasions, and we're not supposed to talk about what goes on in the sit room, as the United States actually contemplated war, contemplated the commitment of forces into combat. Watching him sitting at the end of the table as a professor of law, ensuring that if we committed American troops into combat, that he was doing so consistent with his responsibilities under the Constitution. And then once we determined that under Article 2 of the Constitution, which is where the president can lead in moments of emergency to protect Americans and the United States, he then went through the process of doing the analysis on international law to ensure that we not only committed Americans in accordance with American law, but international law. And then, of course, I remember the night he visited me in Afghanistan, and he wanted to meet some troops. And after visiting my wounded and seeing him with my wounded in a way I've never seen another person, the empathy and the pure love for our wounded troops, I took him to meet at about 3 in the morning a group of troops that seldom have anybody ever visit them. And they weren't out of a fighter squadron or out of a tank battalion or out of an infantry unit or out of a SEAL team. Troops that are out of an organization called the Remains Recovery Platoon. They go out to the battlefield and recover our dead and prepare them to send them home. Nobody ever visits them. And the President of the United States visited them at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I saw him exude more love for those troops than I've ever seen from any other civilian leader. And so I think a lot of American presidents have exuded the kinds of qualities of leadership I would like to see. The pressures on an American president are enormous. No other position in the world demands more of those leaders. But when I think about Jimmy Carter and I think about President Obama, I believe I saw in just those two, beyond the enormous moral strength and leadership of Abraham Lincoln, just in those two living presidents who I've met both, I found leadership that I could admire in both of those gentlemen that I believe is completely consistent with the moral leadership that this country should be exuding every single day around the world.
Thank you so much, General Allen. Bob, I'm going to turn this conversation over to you. Thanks again.
Thank you, General Allen. You have been a marvelous example of the kind of leadership we need and is so important to America. And we, all of us, thank you from the bottom of our hearts.
Thank you
For what you're currently doing and what you've been doing the last 50 years. It's just been marvelous, and I appreciate that. I wanted to say to our audience today that I hope that everybody enjoyed this program and also will find ways to further get involved with the Los Angeles World Affairs Council Town Hall, a great organization with a lot of benefits for you to tap from. So thank you, I'll turn it back over to Kim.
Thank you. Superb job moderating today. And General Allen, this was an honor to have you. As we talked earlier before the program, we want to partner with the Brookings Institution and come back and perhaps do a series on climate change and other critical issues that the Brookings Institution is covering. And for our viewers, we will be providing links to the Brookings Institution so you all can learn all the tremendously important things that they are focusing on and doing to help us all. And as I mentioned earlier, for us, if you all would please do what you can to keep our programs going by typing the word election to this, texting it to this number, and give what you can. Today's quality program is just exemplifies what our organization is trying to do. So please do what you can. Also, go to our website at lawac.org and sign up for a whole slew of tremendous programs. We have Dr. Fiona Hill tomorrow, who will be talking about foreign interference in the 2020 election. We have our politics in the time of coronavirus on Thursdays with Professor Dan Schnur. We have Alex Padilla and others coming up with our 2020 series. So please tune in, and we hope to see you tomorrow. Take care, Bob. General Allen, thank you again so very much. This was tremendous.
Thank you, Kim. It was an honor to be with you today. Thank you, Bob.